Okay, so in this lab, we're going to create launch templates and subsequently auto-scaling groups from those templates. Before I get started with the discussion, uh, let's go ahead and click Start Lab, and we'll wait for the AWS light to go green. So, if you recall from your first course, auto-scaling is the concept of spinning up additional EC2 instances to handle an increased workload or for an anticipated increased workload, such as an event sale that your company's having over the weekend, and then being able to scale down, to go back to your original two or three EC2 instances that you had prior to the sales event. When you create auto scaling groups, though, where do you create them from? So you can create launch templates for your auto scaling groups, and your launch templates don't necessarily have to be the same capacity as your existing EC2 instances. They could be a higher capacity if you wish, or a lower capacity. So it's just the template that you establish. And then if you ever need to scale up, then you could scale up from that template and have additional EC2 instances in your infrastructure. And these additional EC2 instances, again, may be a higher or lower capacity in terms of hardware versus your existing EC2s. Okay, so the green light has turned on. Let's go ahead and get started with the lab. We'll click AWS and we'll follow the lab instructions step by step. The lab takes approximately 45 minutes to complete. Okay, so you've read this before. So we'll jump right away into task one. We'll choose the services menu, locate compute, and choose EC2. Okay, or you can choose EC2 by most recently visited. We'll do it the way the instructions suggest. On the left, we'll click on compute, and then we'll click on EC2. You can click on the shortcuts if you want that are already there. Okay, so they always say make note of which region, right? So you want to make sure you're in the North Virginia East US East 1 region. If you're not, you can click that drop down arrow and select the North Virginia region. So the Amazon EC2 auto scaling resources that we create will be tied to the region that we specified. Okay, and so what we want to do, let me get back to the lab here, is in the left menu, we want to select launch templates. Okay, because right now we have no EC2 instances running. So we'll click on launch templates. And we want to create a new launch template, and we want to configure the name of my template, and we'll give it a description. So we'll click on that, and we'll select launch template. This is the name that's required, and we'll copy in the description, test launch template for an auto scaling group. Okay, so we want them to provide guidance, which is more of a step-by-step process. Okay, now for the AMI, the image that we want to select for our template, we want to use the Amazon Linux 2023 AMI, okay, x86 64. Okay, so we'll choose that from the quick start list. And then we'll make sure we'll choose T2 Micro. Okay, so we want to select Amazon. And it's already selected right here for us, the 2023 AMI 64-bit x86. It's retail eligible. And we want to select, for instance type, we want to select T2 Micro. Okay, and that takes us back to our lab instructions. And then we want to specify the key pair of Aki, and that key pair should already be created for us. Okay, creating key pairs are really no big deal. When you create a key pair, It's simply giving it a name. And again, if you're using a Windows-based system, you want to use the PPK file. And if you're using a Mac, and there's additional instructions on a Mac, you want to use a PEM file. And to log in to the EC2 remotely, you'll need a tool like PuTTY. And actually, when we get into 3300, you're going to find the labs there are very similar to the 2475 course. And these labs are kind of comprehensive, and a lot of them are challenge labs, which don't always include step by step instructions. And if you ever have to create a key pair, you'll have instances where you'll be using PuTTY on your laptop or workstation to connect to an EC2 instance over the internet. Okay. Okay, we don't include a subnet in our launch template. Okay, that would be specified by the subnet we actually create for our VPC, and we're going to skip the security group configuration. We will configure a security group later. Okay, so in the advanced network configuration, choose add network interface and configure with the following settings. Okay, so we'll click on advanced configuration. And we'll make sure I got that right. Add network interface. Got it. So we click the add network interface. And we want to leave the interface as it is, that there should be an auto assign IP address. And configure with the following settings: auto sign, public IP, then choose enable. Here we go. So we want to enable an auto assign public IP. So keep in mind, right, your launch template, if you have an auto scaling solution that goes to your launch template and launches your instances, they'll be launched in a public subnet within availability zone, right? And so with a public subnet, again, you'll use an internet gateway, not a NAT gateway, since your EC2 instances from the launch template will automatically be assigned a public IP. Okay. Now, again, the auto assign, if we go back to last class, the auto assign public IP versus an elastic IP. An elastic IP is a permanent public IP address, and you can look at an auto assigned public IP as getting an IP address from a DHCP pool, which could change. And the elastic IP is obviously a more expensive solution versus an auto assign public IP. Okay. So for security group, we want to choose the security group name that contains EC2 security group. And there it is. It's the second one. Delete on termination. Yet we want to select yes. Okay, so again, when you delete on termination, it will delete the network interface when the auto scaling group scales in and terminates the instance. So scaling in is going back to your original infrastructure. I sometimes use the word scaling down or up, and at times you may hear the term scale out, which is to expand, and then scale in is to condense. Okay, so this is when your instance terminate, and it'll delete the network interface. And then from here, we want to choose create launch template. Okay, and we get a success, and we'll click on View Launch Templates. Choose the link for the launch template ID. And from the Actions menu, I may have to click on it, but no, it says launch. Let me double check the instructions, okay? From the Actions menu, create auto scaling group. Okay, so I may have to click on that link instead of just checking on it. Okay. Create auto scaling group. Okay, so now we're on task 2, which is to create an auto scaling group from a template. And so a template is just what it is, right? It's a pre-configured EC2 instance. We already have the with the Amazon AMI, and it's a T2 micro instance. Okay, we're going to give the auto scaling group a name. So we'll copy and paste my first ASG into the name. Choose the launch template that you created in the previous task, right? So we want to click the drop down arrow. It should be already selected, right? I guess that was it, my template. In fact, let me go back. I'll hit the back button here. There it is. It's my template. Okay. I forgot the name, right? But I want to double check, and that's the name we created for the template. But I can click on it again, and from the Actions menu, create auto scaling group. You got my first ASG in there. The launch template has been specified, my template. And for the version, we want to make sure the latest. And then we want to click next. So again, Amazon's using the term scaling out, which is to expand, and scaling in, which is to go back to your original, right? That those auto scaling solutions go away, right? Because your threshold has been met or the holiday event has ended, right? I'm using the term scaling up or down. It means basically the same. So from here, we'll click next. And on the step 2 page, we want to configure the following. So we want to choose the lab VPC. And so the lab was already created for us. So we want to select lab VPC. And the subnets, we want to choose the public subnet 1. Okay. So you want to make sure public subnet 1. And again, right, if your templates are going to be automatically assigned a public IP address, they have to be launched in a public subnet. Okay. Okay, we'll choose skip to review. And from here, we will double check. And at the bottom, we'll say create an auto scaling group. I'll refresh. Okay, from here, we'll click on EC2. And choose instances running. And we have a T2 micro instance that's being spun up, right? And that matches the key name of Aki and the security group name. And that's based on the ID. So if you go to instance detail, There's a couple of things you want to pay attention to in the details area. And first of all, you want to make sure you're you have an IP. Okay, so let's go to instance summary. Click the drop down arrow. You have a public IP, and you'll always have a private IP, right? Now, why do you have a private IP for an instance in a public subnet? So again, you create a VPC, you create availability zones. The VPC has a parent Class A or Class B address, and it's private, right? And your availability zones are subnetted from that parent address within the VPC, and the private IP addresses are so the objects and instances in your VPC all have local routes and can communicate with each other by their private IP addresses. So the internal VPC communication occurs by the private IP, right? Because it's not routable outside the VPC. It's not routable to the internet because they're private IP addresses. But if you're going to access these instances from the internet, right, or outside of the AWS region you're in, for example, you would need a public IP. Okay. So the status check, it's initializing, and we may have to wait for the two of two checks. Okay, and they'll say we're on step 15. They'll say notice that the EC2 instance has been started. If the EC2 instance does not appear yet, wait for a moment and choose the icon. The instance state shows that it is running. Okay, so we'll wait for the status checks to complete. There we go. And we got two of two checks passed. You can pause the video while I'm speaking, wait for your status checks to come up. But again, let's verify our instance. So we have an instance ID. The instance type is T2 micro. The availability zone, right? You're in the North Virginia region, which is US East 1A. Your public IP. This is your DNS address, and then you have your public IPv4 address. Now, again, if we go to monitoring, security, excuse me, we can verify the security group. And if we click on that security group, we can see what kind of routes they're setting up, or what type of inbound rules, excuse me, that are being set up. So right now, if we look at the inbound rule, they're allowing inbound SSH access, secure shell access on TCP port 22 from any IP address. That is something that you would want to revise because that is not a good rule of thumb. That's not a best practice. You would want to edit that inbound rule. And for the source, okay, you have options. You could specify your IP address. Okay, so your current IP, which would only allow your workstation or laptop to be able to remotely access the EC2 instance. Okay, that's the preferred way of editing the inbound rules and securing your EC2 instance. That's just something to pay attention to. I'm going to leave it as is, 000, just for the purposes of the lab. And then you would add additional rules as appropriate. Okay. One of the things that you'll do later on in these labs is you'll work with access control lists as well, and you'll learn that access control lists kind of do the same thing as security groups, but ACLs work at the IP address level. In other words, we assign an access control list to a device that has an IP address, whereas a security group, yeah, it does traffic filtering, but it's based on objects like all your databases or all your EC2 instances, for example. Okay, you would have security groups. But access list gives you extra granularity in that you can filter source and destination IP addresses. And you got a lot more flexibility. And you'll learn as you create access control list rules that you'll number them. And you'll say, well, why are they numbered from 100 to 200? Right? Your first ACL rule is 100, and your second ACL rule is 200. Why not make it 1 and 2? Well, there's a good reason for that. It's because access control lists are processed in order. Okay. And so you may need to add a rule in between 100 and 200, which is a lot easier to do, right? If you just number them consecutively, you have to edit your entire access control list, right? It's like sorting things, but putting a document between two documents, for example. Okay, and they're processed in order, and access control lists are read in order. So if your first rule says to let everything go through, and your second rule says to block port 80 HTTP access from a certain IP address, well, guess what? Everything's going to be allowed to go through. Okay, so you have to keep that in mind when you're working with access control lists. Okay, one other quick thing I want to show you in regards to the EC2s. Click on instances running, and if I click on the instance ID, okay, and a couple things to pay attention to, the public IPv4 DNS. Now you can use Amazon Route 53 to give it a more DNS user-friendly name. If it was a web server, for an example, and it was something you type into your browser. Okay, you also have a private IP DNS name for the IPv4 only. Okay, if we look at our VPC, if we type VPC in the search and click on it, okay, and we click on VPCs or your VPCs, okay, we have a lab VPC that's created for us, okay? And so, again, this was created by default when we created the lab, but you've created a VPC before, and it's a fairly simple process, right, of configuring the master or the parent IPv4 address, okay? So 10.100, right? The first two octets, 10.1 represent the VPC. And then, for example, if you wanted two availability zones, 10.1.1 would be availability zone 1, and 10.1.2 would be the second availability zone. Okay? And one final thing I wanted to add with regard to the IP addresses is, if you've been through the Cisco Academy and you've done a lot of subnetting, you can't use /29 and 30 subnets because by default, Amazon reserves 5 IP addresses per subnet. And if you use a /29, for example, that's 6 IP addresses. Yeah, and you could assign one to an instance, but you would need one for a gateway. And so you need at least 2 IP addresses. So the farthest down you could subnet and in AWS is a /28. Maybe an exam question, but you can't use /29s and /30s. Okay, and then from here, if you click on your resource map, okay, and we have done this before. Let me expand this window. You can see that our public subnet is connected to the public route table, which is connected to an internet gateway, right? So again, this is the public IP address side of the subnet, okay? It has a public route table that basically says anything not in my routing table, if I don't know a route to a particular destination, send it to the gateway. And that's defined pretty much as the internet. Okay, but you also have internal routes. Okay, so you on the private IP address side, you'll need to communicate with other devices in your VPC or in your subnet, and you can use just local routes for that. And those are created by default. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up the lab. Thank you, and wish everyone a pleasant rest of the day.